So, first week back after Easter recess, and it really was lovely to have a break because the Lords had been getting to me, Parliament had been getting to me. And I don't know if you remember, but just before Easter, actually 45 minutes before recess started, we had a terrible situation whereby there was an announcement sneaked in to a debate on child sexual abuse that effectively even the meagre 5 local inquiries around rape, grooming gangs were going to be postponed, watered down, kind of somehow made more flexible, I think was the phrase that Jess Phillips used. And I was absolutely incandescent and furious. So one thing that happens is if there's a statement by a minister in the House of Commons, then it's repeated in the House of Lords a few days later. So I came back post Easter recess, and of course one of the first things that happened weeks later, it seems to me, was a repeat statement on child sexual abuse, and therefore an opportunity to make my frustration known in relation to the grooming gang scandal. The thing that you can see the brief contribution below, just to explain to you how statements work, which is 20 minutes is given over to front bench, the government, the Lib Dems, and in this instance the Tories, who are now chief opposition party, and then 20 minutes are given to backbenchers to ask questions of the minister about the statement. Having listened to a number of questions, I just was getting more and more wound up because, as per usual, it just was word salad upon word salad. I mean, I really did think, I don't understand what you're talking about, Lord Hanson of Flint. I mean, it just was evasive and irritating. But one thing that was really noticeable was that Lord Hanson of Flint, the Labour minister, was sitting on his own with a whip sitting next to him. Not one member of the Labour backbenchers were in the room. The Lib Dems similarly had a spokesperson, a front bench spokesperson, but no one else. And the Tories, there was a fair scattering and a few of us who were independent. And so I made a rather angry intervention about how the way the minister was discussing it, he was basically saying, we're very happy for any council or any local authority to apply for a grant from the £5 million. As I pointed out, this was highly unlikely that any council was going to apply for a grant to investigate themselves to show that they were implicated in the cover-up of the systematic rape and abuse of young women in their local area. Why would that happen? He didn't answer the question. I'm more making the point that these statements can be useful, but it's also irritating when they just become performative in that way. And the fact that hardly anyone from the Lib Dems or the Labour Party were in the room was proof that this issue is one that everybody feels uncomfortable with. They don't want to talk about it. Usually it's hard to get in on statements. Talking of hard to get in on statements, today we had a repeat of the statement from the House of Commons on the Supreme Court's decision around 4 Women Scotland, and of course the thing which made Easter particularly happy this year, because we had a great victory for the grassroots women's organisations led by 4 Women Scotland, but with many others involved, who won at long last legal clarification of what we all knew was the law anyway, that biological sex should be the basis on which single sex provision was allowed, or not just allowed, provided through the Equality Act. That it was essential that we understood that because somebody said, I am a woman, unless they are a biological woman, it doesn't count, and they therefore cannot facilitate use of rape crisis centres, domestic abuse refuges, and so on and so forth. We've all been celebrating it, right? But a couple of things. It was absolutely, understandably enjoyable watching Kemi Badenoch skewer Keir Starmer and the Labour front benches on the statement in the Commons, because we're all fed up of the way that the Labour Party have handled this situation, and all of the kind of slightly jokey bits around, are you going to apologise to Rosie, and all the rest of it. You know, it's just so irritating that they've managed to drive somebody out of their own party and then cannot bring themselves to look her in the eye, and so on and so forth. That's all fine. The only thing is that it's something galling about it, rather complacent. So when we came to the Lords today, I was very keen to point out that, in fact, all parties do not have clean hands on this. You know, that there are many of us who have been on the receiving end of some abysmal treatment from the Conservative government when they were in government, their front bench, and the Labour Party, both in opposition and now in government, and the Lib Dems permanently useless on this question, that they were more than happy to misinform, absolutely misinform the public about the issue of trans identity and conflating it with biological sex. I think it's, and so I made that point today, because I don't think that this is an appropriate place to play political football or to try and kind of throw around accusations. I mean, listen, we've got the receipts, we've got the scars. Retribution, I'd like nothing more, right? I want to point the finger and blame everyone, but actually what's now got to happen is that we have got to take responsibility as, by the way, parliamentarians, legislators, of unpicking this poisonous ideology from every institution. You know, the reason why trans people can say they've had rights stolen from them is precisely because parliamentarians, in cahoots with Stonewall, allowed the civil service to tell us that the laws that we were making meant that there was no clarity in relation to biological sex, and that therefore trans women, i.e. biological men identifying as women, could access places, sports, institutions, toilets that were marked women only. And so I think that there's so much work to do that rather than kind of just simply blaming people, we have to get on and kind of make amends. A bit of humility is required, in my opinion. And so that's on that one. The other thing that happened in that debate today, even though it was very brief, was that all of the backbenchers who spoke kept talking about we had to show compassion for trans people. What about dignity for trans people? I mean, by the time you finished, I mean, I was like so irritated, and I didn't have time to go into this, but you know, no compassion was shown to the women who've had their reputations trashed, who basically had their lives ruined precisely because they were saying out loud what the law has now confirmed. The idea that all of our empathy and our feeling and our emotion should be aimed at trans people seems to me to indicate that the House of Lords is nowhere near accepting this legal, apparently last word, not a chance. So I think there is a lot of work to do. The other thing I wanted to just briefly talk about is the tobacco and vapes bill, which we just started on discussing in the Lords yesterday. I did quite a long speech on this at second reading, so I'll let that speak for itself. There's going to be something of a fight in relation to this bill, but the first thing to note is that the generational smoking ban, that effectively means that anyone, in the future, there will be a ban for anyone from January 26, I think, who is 16, will never, ever be able to, ever buy tobacco. Right, but their 16-and-a-half-year-old brother or sister or mate will, because that's how mad it is. So in the future, a 29-year-old will be legally able to buy cigarettes, and his 28-year-old sister will be committing a criminal offence if they buy same cigarettes. Now, if they walk out, the 29-year-old gives them a cigarette, apparently that's allowed because they say they are not making it a crime to smoke. You just can't buy them. It's so bonkers. But who designed it? I'll tell you who designed it. Rishi Sunak designed it, and the Conservative Party. So although the Conservative benches are going to be opposing aspects of the tobacco and vapes bill, it is also the case that this was a bill that was drawn up by the Tories, has been cut and pasted by the Labour benches. So it makes it difficult for them to oppose it. The thing that you also need to know in relation to this is that they have introduced into this bill, the Labour Party, 66 delegated powers. That is twice as many as were there under the Tory bill, and 17 Henry VIII clauses. Without going into the detail of this, what that means is that huge swathes of this bill will be decided without any parliamentary scrutiny by secretaries of state, ministers in the future. This is a power grab. This is the executive saying we will not be held accountable. And it is absolutely frightening that most of the bills that are passing through the House of Commons and the House of Lords now have extensive regulatory functions handed over to, with no oversight, to ministers, to parliamentary committees, regulatory, what they're called, regulation committees and things like that. But we won't be able to oppose them. So it does make rather a mockery of the fact I'm about to spend hours of my life discussing a bill that in the end, somebody else, somewhere else will decide the details of. The unintended consequences of the tobacco and vape bill, and I really, if you hate smoking, if you can't stand vapes, disposable vapes, regardless of what you think about it, we live in a free society, and in a free society should be free to buy legal products. And this bill doesn't have the courage to make smoking illegal. It doesn't have the courage to see through what it really wants to do, which is to criminalise anyone who smokes, just half of them. But what it will have is unintended consequences, massively leading to a black market, criminality, all sorts of things, as prohibition always does. But you'll hear me say that a lot in the future. Just on unintended consequences, a story this week has emerged that, of all things, the Shrewsbury, let me get this right, flower show, which has existed for decades, is not happening this year. Why? Because of the unintended consequence of something called Martin's Law, known as Martin's Law, which is the Terrorism Protection of Buildings Act. Now, you will have seen on Inside the Lords me doing lots of speeches on this act and thought, why is she going on? But the truth is that the ministers kept saying, this act will save lives. And some of us who were opposing it kept saying, no, this act will lead to civil society being burdened by regulations, red tape, and lots of money that they can't afford. And it will close down organic public events that ordinary people gather in. And the Shrewsbury Flower Show have said they can no longer afford to carry on because of Martin's Law. And the other thing about Martin's Law is Martin was somebody who was killed tragically in the Manchester Arena bombing. His mother, understandably, Fegan Murray, wanted something to commemorate him, and she thought this was a good idea. But you shouldn't make laws based on keeping the mother of somebody who's been murdered happy. You need to take a step back. And the tragic situation is that Martin was killed not because of poor security at the Manchester Arena, but because a whole swathe of cultural, political and security issues that this Martin's Law Bill Act will never resolve. But it will, sad to say, kill off lots of local community activities. Next time I talk to you, we will be either approaching or even have had the local elections. And so there is something of a febrile atmosphere in Parliament because all of the political parties are looking over their shoulders and worried about how they're going to get on. And inevitably, there is nervousness about a collapse in the Labour vote, a continued collapse of the Conservative vote, the possibility of reform growing. The Greens are in good form, but apart from that, the Lib Dems always think they'll do well in local elections. But anyway, it's local election time. I only mention it because if you're out there campaigning or canvassing, then good luck, whichever party you're working for. I wanted to mention one party that doesn't often get a look in, but I think it's always worth looking around for the small insurgent parties, and that's the SDP, the Social Democratic Party. And I did their podcast recently, so I've attached that on for you to take a look at, because I genuinely think that they are a serious organisation. They're very small. I'm not saying they're going to have major gains, but they have got some councillors, and I think it's a responsibility of all of us to not complain about the mainstream and then not look at those challenger parties. So do take a look at that. And the other thing that I've attached is the Penny D podcast, which I did an interview with Penny, who came to the Buxton Battle of Ideas. She's a journalist, and she asked me on her podcast to talk about all things sex and gender related. And I hope that you enjoyed that. We actually filmed it, or we did the interview just before the Supreme Court verdict came through. And Penny was one of the first people who sent me a message saying, yippee. And I wish her luck with her podcast, and I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation, because I certainly enjoyed having that conversation. See you next time.